Hello, everybody. This week is Kant Part 2. We talked about Chapter 9 last week, which is titled Absolutism. We talked about Kant's absolutism views, and we also got the first out of the three components that we have to factor in if we are Kantian in our ethical situations. And Chapter 10, which was the assigned reading for this week, is going to give us the other two components. And Chapter 10 spends most of the time talking about Kant's justification for capital punishment, which is something that we might talk about later in the semester. But for right now, I'm concerned with understanding the rest of his theory. So the first part that we got was the categorical imperative, and this was acting in such a way that whatever maxim or moral rule we're acting from, we would wish that everybody in the world followed it, and if they did, our goals would still be accomplished. So remember, the idea is we universalize a moral rule in order to be consistent and fair and not make exceptions for ourselves. And the remaining two components are both on page 137 of chapter 10, which is right off the bat in chapter 10. And the first one I want to talk about is at the bottom of 137, and your book actually calls this the categorical imperative also, which makes it a little bit confusing because it's a very different prescription than the other categorical imperative we saw last week. And make sure you watch that lecture if you haven't already. But what this is typically called is either the principle of dignity or the principle of humanity. Principle of dignity is what I'll be referring to it as. So this tells us to act so that we treat humanity, whether in our own person or in that of another, always as an end and never as a means only. So here's a specific prescription for how we're supposed to treat other people. So treating somebody as an end versus treating somebody as a means. When you treat somebody as a means, you're just using them for some personal gain. So you might use somebody as a means to, I don't know, have a ride if your car broke down, somebody as a means for money or fame or sex or whatever it is. When you use somebody and you don't really care about who they are as a person, you just care about what they can do for you. Contrast this with treating somebody as an end. When you treat somebody as an end in and of themselves, you treat them as a person that is worthy of dignity and respect, regardless of whether or not they can actually do anything for you. Now, we treat people as means all the time, and it's unavoidable in our society. I'm a means for you to get another grade and credits closer to your degree. You're a means for me to have a job and a paycheck. And that's fine, provided that along the way we're not just treating each other as that thing that can get me what I want. We have to treat the other person with respect and dignity on top of whatever they might be able to do to benefit me. So we need to make sure that we're treating people in a specific way, not just what can you do for me and I'm going to take that from you, but rather as an end in and of themselves. And what's interesting to notice here is that this also applies to yourself. So it's whether your own person or in that of another. So Kant thought that we had just as much more responsibility to the way we treat ourselves as we do to the way that we treat other people. And not everybody's going to agree with that. So here in America, a not uncommon viewpoint is to say, I can do whatever I want to my own body. It's my life. And, it doesn't matter. I can eat fast food every day. I can do drugs. I can do whatever I want. Because as long as I'm not harming anybody else, I can do whatever I want to myself. But Kant's going to disagree. We have just as much responsibility in the way that we treat ourselves as in the way that we treat others. So think about the kinds of ways we might treat ourselves as a means to an end. That might be something good to write about in the discussion post for this week, especially if you haven't been keeping up with those. We don't have a whole lot of weeks left here, so make sure you do 4 of those. So some of the problems with the categorical imperative are that there are a few things that maybe we'll get through that we don't want to. Some things that actually would pass, that would be universalizable, that we don't want to say are morally right. So here's an example. Let's say that your neighbor is one of those people that is obsessed with their lawn, looking perfect all the time. Everybody probably has known somebody like this in their lifetime. They're the people that call and complain when your grass is a little bit too long. So let's say that this person is very frustrated with the mail carrier because the mailman constantly walks on the grass and it is hindering the beauty of the lawn. Now, if this person were to run the categorical imperative, to figure out what they should do in this situation. Let's say they get so mad one day that they end up shooting and killing the mailman because the mailman keeps walking on the grass even though they've asked him not to. Now, remember, first we need to clearly state our maxim. So my maxim here would be I can do whatever I need to in order to maintain the beauty of my lawn. Now let's imagine everybody in the world had that same maxim, that they would do whatever they needed to preserve the beauty of their lawn. Now remember, the third thing that we want to ask is not would I want to live in that world or any sort of subjective question. Instead, it's would the original goal be accomplished? Well, if everybody did whatever it took to preserve the beauty of their lawn, this guy's goal would be accomplished because his lawn would be pristine and beautiful and everybody else's would be too, and he would probably be very happy about that. So it would be universalizable, but there's no way that we're going to say that killing your mail carrier is the morally right thing to do under like any circumstances, particularly just for walking on your grass. So it passes the categorical imperative, but we want to say that it's wrong. Now here's where having a more complex ethical system like Kant does with the three components comes in handy. It's a little bit more complicated to remember and to apply, but it's got more fail-safes built in. So even if killing your mailman for walking on your grass might pass the categorical imperative, it's not going to pass the principle of dignity because we have to treat people as an end in and of themselves and not just as a means. And by killing your mail carrier because he's messing up your grass, you are not treating him as an end in and of himself. You're treating him as a means to your grass looking the way that you want or whatever. So with other things like social contract theory and utilitarianism, there were a lot of things that maybe made it through and the theory would say that's right or that's wrong and we would disagree. And that's part of the problem with a very simplistic theory. With Kant, we're going to have a better chance, I think, overall of things working out the way that we want when we factor all three things in. So that's the second thing, is it's not just enough to be consistent and fair with the categorical imperative, we also have to treat people in a specific way with the principle of dignity. And then the third component is also on 137, up a little bit higher in the middle of that third paragraph, and that is that we have to act from the goodwill. So your book defines this as apprehending what we should do and acting from a sense of duty. Now, goodwill sounds kind of like, Goodwill Hunting, and we don't typically use the word will in this way anymore, but when you will something, it's not just a wish. It's actually sort of like taking the steps to make it happen. So I will my arm to go up, and I will it to wave. My hands look humongous, don't they? When we act from the goodwill, it means that our motivation is correct. So remember back to utilitarianism a few weeks ago, the only thing they cared about were the consequences of our actions. It was just the outcome. They didn't care about your intention or your motivation whatsoever. And here with Kant, we're going to get the complete opposite extreme, where all he cares about is the motivation, and the intentions and the consequences don't matter at all. And part of the reason for this is something that we pointed out as a problem with utilitarianism, and that is that sometimes the outcome of our actions isn't necessarily foreseeable, and sometimes it's not even within our control. So if I'm trying to help somebody across the street, they accidentally get hit by a car and die, a utilitarian would say I was morally wrong for helping them, but that doesn't seem right. It seems like my intention was to be helpful and morally right and do a good thing for somebody else. It's not really my fault that it ended tragically. It stinks that it ended tragically, but I'm not held morally accountable for that for most people. And so Kant recognized that if all we care about are the outcomes, then that means morality is not entirely within our control, because other factors and circumstances can affect the outcome of our actions. So Kant thought, if we're talking about whether or not I'm a good person, that has to be something that I have control over. I'm not going to allow the universe or other people or circumstances to dictate whether or not I'm right or wrong. I have to be able to do it for myself, and I have to be able to know if what I'm doing is right or wrong. Remember, again, with utilitarianism, if all that matters is the entire outcome, that might extend past even when we're alive, and we might die never knowing whether or not we did the right thing. So we have to act from the goodwill. And what that means is we have to do the right thing for the right reason. And the right reason is it's the right thing to do because we have a moral obligation. So this is not one of those series that just says, "Oh, as long as you avoid harming people, you're doing fine and you're a good person. If you decide to actively do nice things to help people, we admire you, but you don't really have to do that to be good." This is not saying that at all. There are moral duties, moral obligations that everybody has, whether you like it or not. And you have to fulfill those obligations simply because it's the right thing to do. So not because you're going to benefit from it, not because you want to make people happy or hope that they treat you better as a result. No, you have to do it simply because it's the right thing to do. So for Kant, if there was a very wealthy man who was annoyed with a bunch of coins in his pocket, who just absentmindedly kind of threw them at a beggar because they were annoying in his pocket and heavy, even if that money went on to save the beggar's life and completely turned his whole world around, Kant would say that there was nothing morally correct about this action because he didn't do it for the right reason. He didn't do it because he felt an obligation to. He did it just because it was annoying to have the change in his pocket and he didn't even really think about it. So it'd be like a child who accidentally makes a good move in chess. We wouldn't say they were a good chess player if they didn't understand what was happening and just happened to move a piece in a strategic location by accident. So we can kind of see where Kant's coming from if you consider two people working at a soup kitchen, one of whom is there because they feel an obligation to give back to their community and to help those less fortunate because they've been blessed to not have to worry about where their next meal is going to come from. Contrasted with somebody who's only at the soup kitchen because it's court-ordered community service and they don't want to get a fine or go to jail. Now, even if they end up helping people equally and the outcome is the same, we do view these people differently from a moral standpoint because the one person seems to be doing this out of a sense of moral obligation, which seems a lot more respectable and virtuous to us than somebody that's only there because they have to be. So this is what Kant was getting at. And Kant, anticipating Freud by over 100 years, did say that we might never be 100% sure what our motivation really is. We might think that we're doing it from the goodwill, from a sense of duty, when in actuality, maybe there's some sort of self-interested motivation. But at least we know what our motivation should be, and we can try to nail that as much as possible. So we've got the three components here. The categorical imperative from chapter 9, which tells us that we have to be consistent and fair and not make exceptions for ourselves. We have the principle of dignity on page 137, which tells us we have to treat people with the dignity and respect they deserve as humans and not just as a means to whatever we're hoping to gain from them. And then third, we have to act from the goodwill, which means knowing the right thing to do, doing the right thing, and doing it for the right reason. And that right reason is it's the right thing to do, and we have a duty to do what is right. So the word right appears in there a whole lot of times. So in the real world, we would like an ethical theory that has a blending of how much our motivations count and how much the outcome counts. And we've managed to do this pretty well in our legal system. So if you murder somebody on purpose and it's premeditated, that's obviously a very serious thing. If you kill somebody on accident, it's manslaughter. Now, in both cases, there's a punishment because the outcome matters and somebody's dead because of you. But on the one hand, your intention was to kill them, and so the punishment is much more severe than in the manslaughter incident where you didn't want to kill them, you didn't intend to kill them, there was just sort of some accidental circumstance. So we factor in the outcome and the motivation. Now, why aren't you going to get this in an ethical theory? Why do you get the extremes? Well, a big reason why is because remember that an ethical theory can't go through every possible ethical dilemma that you might ever find yourself in and tell you, in this situation, here's what to do. In this situation, here's what to do. That's just not possible. So we have these generalized theories, and that's why a lot of stuff tends to fall through the cracks. And with a generalized theory, there's really no way to explain how much motivation should count, how much the outcome should count, in what circumstances does one maybe count more than the other. There's just no way to do that generically. So we're sort of left with both extremes. And you're free to like one over the other. You don't have to like either. But Kant's whole bit was, we need to be consistent, we need to be fair, we need to treat people a specific way, and we need to have the proper motivation if our actions are going to be considered moral. Your quiz will be up by the time this is up, so make sure you take that by Friday. Let me know if you have any questions. Otherwise, have a great week.